All right. So, not all marriages succeed. Let's be honest. You might have heard that half of all marriages end in divorce. Um, that's a faulty statistic. That statistic is based on how they calculate the divorce rate. So, what they do is they count up how many marriages occurred in a year and divide it by the number of divorces that happened in a year. And so there are a lot of mistakes in that calculation, right? You've got everybody who's been married who knows how many different years getting divorced in this particular year versus all of those who are choosing to get married in this particular year. So that's a little bit off right there. Um, that kind of math is quick and easy, but it also can be faulty. Um, the Census Bureau asks every 10 years whether a person's married or not, whether they've gotten divorced since the last census, and so on. And what they've found is that 28% of first marriages end in divorce within 20 years. So it's a much lower number than we've been told, right? I mean, it's not half. It's not even 30%. Well, if you live together before you get married, it raises the likelihood of divorce by about 10%. So if you didn't live together first, about 28% of first marriages will end in divorce. If you live together before your first marriage, about 38% end in divorce. So it's not quite the 50% that they tell us. Let's just put it that way. So things that are associated with more likelihood of success. Getting married between the ages of 20 and 30. This is not what's happening in our modern era. It's been going up over the past 30 years from what used to be the average age being about 23 for women and 25 for men. Now we're at, the last time I looked, our data was at like 27 for women and 29 for men. We're pushing it and getting out of that sweet window of success. People who get married between the ages of 20 and 30 have room left in their identity for melding another person into it. Whereas once you're 30, you are so secure in your sense of self that there's not much room for bringing another person in. And you tend to view that person as a benefit as long as they remain a benefit. And they're not really part of your sense of self. So research has suggested that the prime ages to get married are between the ages of 20 and 30. In our culture, if you are closer to the 20 side, you'll be told you're crazy. It's never going to work if you're that young when you get married. People saying that doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I'm just going to put that one out there. Another thing that's associated with successful marriage is having at least one child, and especially if that child is male. It's much less likely that a father wants to leave, especially if it's a boy. So now this is not a guarantee. Having children is very stressful and can be the impetus for a divorce. So none of this is a guarantee. It just boosts the likelihood of success. If your own parents are still married, or if at least one of the sets of parents in this marital couple is still married, your probability of staying married yourself goes up. So it doesn't have to be both sets of parents are still married, but at least one set being a role model. If the couple engages in positive communication, even when they're arguing, we talked about that before, the ways that John Gottman talked about, positive communication. Even when you're arguing, having positive communication is associated with a more likelihood of success. Now, what makes a marriage work? Here's a Pew Research results. And they collected this data in 1990, 2007. They're probably getting ready to replicate again and give us another set of data. But kind of the years don't matter as much to me as like the bigger bars, like faithfulness. The number one thing that everybody seems to agree that is important in a marriage is that the partners are faithful to each other. So that's a really important, and it continues to be an important factor. Having a happy sexual relationship is the number 2 here. And then we have things that have to do with like egalitarianism, sharing chores, having enough income, having a decent place to live. Then we get into things like shared religious beliefs, shared tastes and interests. Having children has become less important than it was back in 1990, but it's still there. And then agreeing on politics. And this number is probably getting bigger. At this point, it was about 12% in 1990, about 12% in 2007, but it's getting more and more. Some people won't even date somebody whose politics don't agree with them. And so this is becoming much more important, I think, for people. So these are some factors that the Pew Research survey research has pointed out that people seem to think are important for a successful marriage. Now, some negative effects, some things that make it more likely that a marriage will dissolve are things like living together first. Like I said, it raises the risk about 10%. It's not, a lot of times people hear this and they say, but I and my romantic partner are living together and we're never going to get divorced or whatever, because we're getting married, but we're never going to get divorced. Nobody's talking about any individuals, for one thing, and we're only talking about like a 10% boost. If we reframe this information, we could say that if it's 28% of first-time marriages without cohabitation end in divorce, let's flip that and say they have a 72% chance of success, whereas a couple who lives together before their first marriage, there's a 38% chance of divorce, so that means there's a 62% chance of success. So I'm not trying to give the impression that premarital cohabitation is a guaranteed, death knell for a first marriage. I also want to point out premarital cohabitation only has that effect on first marriages. If it's the second marriage for either partner, cohabitation seems to help to solidify the marriage and make it more likely to succeed. So I'm only talking about for first marriages. The presence of stepchildren, again, stressors, right? So when you have stepchildren, you not only have children, that's already stressful, but now you also have somebody's ex. And a lot of times when there are stepchildren involved, even when it's the man's children, he will tend to defer to his new wife, for parenting issues and leave a lot of that to her. And so then what ends up happening is you've got your new wife and your ex, the mother of your children, in conflict. And that really contributes to a lot of stress in a marriage. So it's not that the stepchildren are bad or something like that. It's just that it adds stress. Being of African American ethnicity is associated with a higher risk of divorce. And so here we see, this data is from 1995. I can't find a newer depiction that breaks it down easily. But what we've got is how long in years the people have been married. So it starts at, the newlywed phase, and then we're out to 15 years. And then the percent, they called it disrupted, who ended up breaking up or divorcing. And so what you see is this lowest bar, the sort of grayish blue bar, is non-Hispanic Asians. Laying on exactly on top of each other practically would be the yellow Hispanic bar and the dark blue non-Hispanic white bar. And then the lightest gray bar is the non-Hispanic black. And what you see is a much higher rate of divorce by 15 years for non-Hispanic blacks than you see for Hispanics or non-Hispanic whites, and way higher than non-Hispanic Asians. So there's clearly cultural factors that go into, marital success. There's a higher rate of success of a marriage when the couple is surrounded by a culture, whether it's the larger culture or their family culture or their neighborhood culture, that values their marriage, that wants their marriage to succeed and helps that couple to work through it. Okay, this is a dumb example. I was just watching an old episode of Little House on the Prairie this very morning, the day I'm recording this video. And on this episode, if you're familiar at all, Mrs. Olsen and Mr. Olsen were having a family squabble that was so bad that he moved out and was living in the boarding house that I never knew was in Walnut Grove till this episode. Now, Mrs. Olsen is a very snooty and mean lady, if anyone doesn't know who I'm talking about. So she's snooty and mean. And so no one can blame Nels, her husband, if he wants to move out and leave her, because she henpecks him and berates him and all sorts of things. But, you know, she said, fine, I'm going to take the children and I'm going to go back east. And that caused the Ingalls family, who are the center of this show, to realize, you know, that the whole town would be, you know, different if the Olsons didn't live there. And so they worked to try and get the husband and the wife to make amends and ultimately recognize that they still love each other, and that the husband actually likes all these aversive characteristics that the wife has and so on. And so they reunited. The reason why I brought it up is because it's exactly what we're talking about with cultural support. You know, in this town, they obviously are very supportive of this couple staying together. And so they were helping them to get over their egos and their entrenchment with their argument and that kind of thing. When you have that kind of support, it's much more likely that a couple can work things out, remember why they got married, and see the good in each other and so on. When the culture that you're surrounded by is telling you, you know, you can always just move on, find another one. It's a lot easier to move on and find another one, right? These are factors that undermine and make it easier for people to get divorced, even though marriage has a lot of benefits to it. The benefits tend to convey to both sexes. A lot of people who are against marriage will say, well, it just benefits men or something. There's something about marriage that is more attractive to men. Like, men who have been married and then got divorced are much more likely to remarry than women who have been married and got divorced. So there is something to that statement, that there's something in it that men benefit from more because they're more willing to re-enter into marriage. That's true. But that doesn't mean that the structure is set up to benefit men in some way. It's probably more that men are getting their needs met more. Their intimacy needs are met by marriage more than women's intimacy needs are met. And so it probably has something more to do with that and less about some kind of structural problem that I won't go into the politics of all of that. So there are some things that we can't help that might make it more likely that we might become divorced. There are some attitudes that all of us have probably adopted, where we think the older we are, the better. Okay, I'm going to reveal another terrible show that I watch. Maybe some of you watch it and appreciate it. Married at First Sight. For those of you who haven't seen it, it's a show where, surprisingly, they get married at first sight. So there are experts who try to pair up these volunteers who want to enter into this experiment and see if they can be match made into a marriage that works. And so they meet with the experts, they fill out a bunch of surveys, do all the things, and then the experts put them together. And the hope is, to go back to Sternberg's theory of love, that they'll start in empty love, where all they have is the commitment, and that the intimacy and the passion will grow, and then they will be ultimately into consummate love is the goal. But what's been happening, like the first season that they ever did this, two of the three couples stayed married for a really long time. One of the couples stayed married for like 5 or 6 years probably. The other couple is still married today, and the show first aired like more than 10 years ago. And they've got 3 children, and they seem to be doing fine. So the first season was pretty successful as far as matching people who have stayed a long time. And across all the seasons, they've had a number of successful couples that are still married and have children and seem to be in a consummate love kind of situation. But recently, over the last probably 3 iterations, they've really been focusing on matching people who are in their 30s. And none of the couples have stayed married. Not one over the past 3 cycles. And so, well, the last cycle, somebody might still be married, but I mean, it's been months. So one of the things I keep yelling at the TV is, why do you keep going older and older? Like, that's a really important factor. I think that's something really important that we all need to reiterate here is, being between the ages of 20 and 30 seems to be a sweet spot for finding a mate, getting married, merging your personalities, merging your interests, merging your goals, so that you become a team as opposed to two people who live in the same house and maybe have children together and things like that, but don't really blend. If you're too well developed in your sense of identity, it's harder to make that blending. So I'm going to go back to if you have control over a lot of these you don't have control over. You don't have control over whether your parents are still married. You don't even have control over whether your arguments take a positive tone. Like, you can do your side, but we may end up in an argument that isn't that productive because we feel like the other person isn't being nice or whatever. And so some of it you don't have control over. You certainly don't have control over whether you can have children, and if you can have children, whether the one that you have is a boy. Like, you don't have control over a lot of this stuff. The one thing you have control over is age at marriage and whether you cohabit before your first marriage. Like, these are the two things that maybe you could internalize the messages that I'm sharing, and you can make decisions that are maybe based on data. I don't know. All right. So I think I hit on most of the big motives that ultimately can lead to commitment to work, commitment to a marriage, commitment to somebody else. In the next video, we're finally going to get to the chapter on happiness. So I will see you in happiness.